Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Here in New York, while we revel in the riches being delivered to us, we also unwittingly accept some of the world's deepest evil. That's slavery. There are people on our streets forced to provide services who are held against their will, under violence or the threat of violence, and paid nothing. We call that human trafficking, and it is the modern day equivalent of the slave trade, as well as being the fastest growing criminal industry in the world. My guest is Norma Ramos, an activist for social justice and the executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Welcome. Trafficking is different, isn't it, than smuggling?
Yes. In trafficking, there is an involuntary relationship and taking advantage of a person's vulnerability. And the relationship continues throughout the exploitation for the most part. In smuggling, the relationship ends once the destination has been reached.
And the payment is made up front or less, but it's over. Tell us about this trafficking and this international organization that you direct. I mean, the Coalition Against Trafficking for Women, it's all over the world.
Yes, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, we are now in our 22nd year, is actually the world's first organization to fight human trafficking internationally. And we are now the world's leading abolitionist organization with over 400 partners worldwide.
So abolitionist means what?
Well, we take the position that we have a vision of the world, and that world is one that is free of commercial sexual exploitation of all human beings, and one that's free of forced labor. Human trafficking involves commercial sexual exploitation and forced labor.
And now your constituency has expanded beyond just women.
Yes, well,
although major emphasis is on women?
Well, because the vast majority of those who are trafficked are women and girls.
Right.
The statistic that is most cited is that 80% of all human trafficking victims are women, and 70% of those end up in commercial sexual exploitation.
Which is like what?
Well, for the most part, we're talking about prostitution, but women can be trafficked into, besides overt prostitution, strip shows, all kinds of commercially sexually exploited conditions, including, by the way, pornography.
And escorts, all that kind of thing, right?
Yes.
And so how does it work? When we say trafficking, is it still a concept to an average American like me of something that happens in another world?
Well, I think so. A lot of people don't understand that it's happening actually all over the world, including right here in New York City. And even though the vast majority of it includes commercial sexual exploitation, it can also include labor exploitation. For instance, there was a very high-profile case that took place a few years ago where two women were trafficked into a domestic work situation where they endured horrific abuse and were not discovered until one of them was able to get out of the house and received some help from someone who saw her. She was barely clothed. So we're talking about all kinds of situations, but the vast majority still does include commercial sexual exploitation, and that is something actually we should talk about, because a lot of the ways that sex trafficking unfolds, prostitution meets that definition. Pimps are traffickers. So a lot of the tactics that pimps use to sell women and girls to Johns, to buyers, meets the definition of human trafficking.
Even if it's not from one country to another, just within the same community.
And that is really where the myth...
So that changes a lot of things.
It certainly does. A lot of the myths that surround prostitution, we have to spend a lot of time around debunking, because a lot of people still don't understand, and they'll say things like, well, isn't that the world's oldest profession? And we say, no, take the P off of that. It's the world's oldest oppression. And when there is a pimp involved, you're actually looking at human trafficking. Now, the International Rapporteur for Human Trafficking, the UN system, which has experts on issues, she found in her report, the former rapporteur, her name was Sigma Huda, and she said...
Where was she from?
She was from Bangladesh. And she says in her report that, again, the way that prostitution unfolds in most ways around the world meets the definition, and that most human trafficking victims are born within their countries. So it's not this exotic, even though that happens and we need to address that. In the United States, it's estimated anywhere from 14 to 17,000 human beings are brought in from other countries, trafficked for labor and commercial sex. And I'm sure those numbers are low. But if you understand human trafficking, you understand that most human trafficking victims never left the United States. They were born here, they're U.S. citizens, and they are being exploited in the ways that we're talking about.
Is being a pimp a relatively new profession?
Well, I wouldn't.
Within prostitution. I mean, when I was young, and they used to talk about the prostitutes on the corner of such and such street, or were they involved with pimps?
Well, many are. And now and then. I wouldn't say that it's new. In fact, we say that pimping is the oldest profession.
That's interesting.
So, yeah.
And so it's that whole, so that is really a violent act.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's an inherently exploitive act. And one of the things that we try to get people to understand as we do this work and try to increase awareness of what needs to be done is to understand that what we're talking about is so damaging to the human spirit. There's a tremendous amount of violence done. And we're now living in a culture that is glamorizing prostitution and pimping. We've had a campaign at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women against HBO because they have done a show called Cat House, and they kind of joke around with it and call it a documentary. But what they've done is they've put a camera in a brothel in Nevada, and they are promoting the most romanticized, glamorous views of the world's oldest oppression.
And you changed the whole justice side of prostitution. You call the women the prostituted.
Yes.
And you would say, don't arrest the women.
Right.
But arrest the Johns.
Yes.
If you're going to have this. But otherwise eliminate the whole thing.
Well, we support a human rights approach to addressing on the sex trafficking side. We support a human rights-based approach. The best example that we've seen in the world is the Swedish model. And what they did was, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, Sweden was really facing major levels, increased levels of human trafficking. And they had to decide what were they going to do. Were they going to go the route of Germany or the Netherlands?
Excuse me for a minute, but when you say human trafficking, was this importing Russians to Sweden?
A lot of Eastern Europeans, yes. And we're talking about a part of the world that, for all of its weaknesses, was moving in the direction of achieving some measure of equality for women. For all of its other weaknesses, that's been documented. So women lost a lot with the collapse of the Soviet Union and became very vulnerable to traffickers. And Sweden, because of its geographic location, was experiencing high levels of human trafficking, primarily for sex trafficking. So they had to decide where they were going to go with this. They looked at Germany, they looked at the Netherlands, who had legalized, and also because legalizing prostitution, of course, becomes a gift to the traffickers and makes that country a magnet for all forms of commercial sexual exploitation. Sweden did something very interesting. They decided to consult with their human rights activists who had been working against human trafficking and asked them for advice. Very radical notion,
Right,
isn't it?
Yes,
To
definitely.
rely on their human rights experts for a solution. And they did that. And we also had, for instance, Catherine McKinnon from this country and Andrea Dworkin had gone there and given a speech. And then you had some experts there like Gunilla Ekberg, a former director of Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. And the organizations there consulted with their government, and they came up with what is now known as the Swedish model, which has now been passed by Norway and Iceland and is being looked at in other parts of the world. That Swedish model says a number of things. Number one, it recognizes that prostitution is violence against women and antithetical to the goal of achieving equality for women. So they made the decision that they wanted to discourage that. They made the decision that prostitution and commercial sexual exploitation is driven by the demand. So they wanted to discourage the purchase of human beings for sex.
What does that mean?
So it is the men who are criminalized and the women who are given an exit strategy.
And the people who find themselves involved in this are promised all kinds of things. I mean, is there a basic deception in the business dealings between the trafficker and the victim?
Yes, there's a lot of deception that's used, a lot of violent tactics, and then there's also traffickers identifying those who are easy marks.
The most vulnerable?
Yeah.
So how do they do that? Who's the most vulnerable?
Well, throughout the world, the most vulnerable to, if you're talking about commercial sexual exploitation, are girls who've been sexually abused in childhood.
That is the crime of the worst proportions, right? Because it becomes responsible for so many different outlets of violence. It's incredible.
Well, I think you've robbed when you sexually abuse a child, you've robbed a child of so much. You've done tremendous spiritual damage, and you've compromised their ability to build a life full of choices. There are those that say, oh, prostitution is a choice, and we've been very clear, and we've said that is not a choice. That is a function of lack of choice, for the most part.
It's a desperate effort to survive, I guess. When they have mail order brides, what's that like?
Well, that's exactly what it sounds like, and it's a part of human trafficking. And again, it's creating a market where there are women who are desperate, who lack opportunities to create a life of their own independence, and those women become a market for men who want to buy women that they have more power over.
So the women are interviewed, but the men, it's an uneven decision, isn't it? As to you're going to become a bride of whom.
Right.
Right. Now, if you extend it to labor, how does that work?
Well, labor trafficking, of course, you're looking at some of the most exploitive forces as well. You're looking at employers who want to do the opposite of what fair bargaining with a labor union would look like, which is to employ workers that's respectful of labor, give them a living wage, give them health benefits, retirement benefits. You're looking at workers who want to take, again, vulnerable populations, work them to death, work them without any protections for their well-being or to pay them a salary. So you're looking at very exploitive people.
So is that mostly, though, trafficking from outside of a community into a community? I mean, where they offer an unemployed person or a person who isn't making enough money or any money a job opportunity.
Yes.
Then they bring them here, and then it turns out it costs them $40,000, and they have to work that $40,000 or $50,000, whatever it is, off before they're free.
It can look like that, and it can look like debt bondage, the same kind of scenario that you just described. India, for instance, has tremendous debt bondage. And also brothels, the debt bondage scenario, by the way, includes sex trafficking as well. It's a way that brothels keep women, prostituted women, constantly in slavery through debt bondage. It's a way to achieve labor trafficking and sex trafficking.
And what do we talk about of marriage of a man with many wives? What do we call that?
There are those who do a human trafficking analysis of that as well. There's a lot of analysis that can be had and discussed, gender-based analysis around marriages that men marrying many wives. There's very many people see that as inherently exploitive.
Right. And all of these unequal relationships, in a way, it's violence, right? If you use, in this country, if you're an immigrant family and you use the green card as the lever, that's violence. So there's a narrow thing between the trafficking and violence against, right, family violence. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
All right. Tell me about the organization. You're in how many countries?
Well, we have offices throughout the world. We have partners throughout the world, over 400. We have offices in the Philippines. We have a wonderful partner in Mexico who does tremendous work throughout Latin America. And we do a lot of advocacy in Europe. And so it's Asia, Mexico, and we're increasing our work. We're in the process of doing more work in Africa as well.
And what do you do there? How are you going to stop this?
Well, a lot of our work involves creating the legal, social, and political conditions that are hostile to human trafficking. One of the most effective ways to create a society, a country, a state that is free of human trafficking is to make sure you do not legalize prostitution. So that has been a core aspect of our work. But many of our partners, for instance, in Italy, we have a partner, a wonderful Nigerian woman there, Esoe Agasti. She runs a shelter for trafficked women, women who've been trafficked from Nigeria into Italy. And so some of our partners have to run shelters, but all the while that they're doing that direct service provision, they are doing political advocacy, sensitizing their governments as to what needs to be done to stop the traffic and to address the victims. Getting the culture not to accept prostitution is very important. And we have that problem right here in the United States, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it used to be a very good liberal position, and I think there are still many people who believe that if you legalize prostitution, you're going to settle a lot of the problems. But as we learn more and more about the role of pimps and the exploitation of the women who enter into these agreements with these men, I think that brings it up that it is not a legal thing. So does that go to basically people who have not had good educations, who have, as you said, been abused as children, who don't see another way to live in their lives?
Well, what we've learned, and the Coalition Against Trafficking Women has learned a lot. We take our leadership from survivors. What we've learned of those who've survived commercial sexual exploitation is that, and going right back to what you just said, which is something I'm very passionate about, because personally I'm politically progressive, and I've been very concerned about liberals thinking that the way to address this incredibly abusive exploitation is to legalize it. We wouldn't take that position with anything else, would we? There's a wonderful early abolitionist. Her name was Josephine Butler. She was in England, and she was inspired by the work of William Wilberforce and the work to end the transatlantic slave trade. And she's one of our heroes. And Josephine Butler said, and I'm going to paraphrase, that though murder has existed in the world and robbery, we've never said that these things and have always existed, so let's make a place for it where we will tolerate murder and robbery. But with prostitution, we've got liberals who say, well, it's always existed, so let's make a place for it. No, we need to create a world that is defined by social justice and would not tolerate the sexual exploitation of anyone.
It's a very interesting line in the way you've developed it, because on the opposite side is let's legalize it and call people sex workers.
Right.
And almost recognize it as a profession, as a regular profession or a union or something that you could do. So you're saying the other way, that it's exploitation, it's a loss of dignity, it's an excessive power over other people.
And it's not labor.
And
that's
it's not
the
labor.
Key to this, because with labor, the whole, we understand what work looks like. But we're talking about prostitution, which a Canadian study found prostituted human beings have a higher mortality rate than anybody else. And a wonderful partner of ours, Melissa Farley, who runs the Prostitution Research and Education organization, PRE, take a look at her work. She has documented that all the practices that unfold, many of what is done to prostituted human beings, women and girls, and now increasingly boys, looks like torture. This is not labor. This is tremendous abuse of human beings who've already been abused. And we have to think about, where is this coming from? Because this is something I always talk about with people in my progressive circles. And I just don't believe that men and boys
Are they not agreeing with you? Or are you saying that you're in a lot of arguments with the progressive friends?
Well, I wouldn't say a lot of arguments, because it does, anybody who cares about social justice is very clear about commercial sexual exploitation. So it's just there are some who have, let's say, taken more of an ACLU line. And one of the things that I say about that is, when you talk about creating a world that involves social justice, you don't want to leave commercial sexual exploitation intact. You want to create a world where people and children have grown up safe and have choices, because after all, nobody looks at their newborn baby child and says,
I hope you'll become a prostitute, right?
We all understand to the heart of us what this is.
So that means really that you need a very strong education campaign.
That's been a cornerstone of our work. A cornerstone of our work.
I mean, we have to debunk the myth that this is, in fact, something that should be accepted.
Yes.
Not necessarily respected, but accepted. I mean, it draws everything into it. It's the violence against women, period, right? Or
Yes.
violence against people. So you're perfectly right when you bring it down to a sense of a just society. If one person has excessive power over another, that should go.
Domination. Well, I was about to say the other thing is it becomes, the women's movement that you have been a part of your whole life has always said the personal is political. I think that's one of the most powerful examples that we have. It's a very transformative idea. And I've always said, about getting back to this discussion, is that I wonder why we have so many men who want to do this to women and girls, who want to hurt women and girls in this way. Because I will never believe that men and boys come into this world wanting to abuse women and girls in order to have sex. I think one of the difficult things we have to look at is how male sexuality is being socialized. What are the forces that are socializing male sexuality in this direction? We have a lot of those discussions at the UN and within the women's rights community, and we have to look at pornography, which is different from erotica, because pornography is reaching children at younger. I saw a study that said the average age of exposure to pornography is 8 years old. So what are the ideas in pornography that are socializing male sexuality in a way that's moving them in this direction? Victor Malarick wrote a book called The Johns. I recommend everyone to read that book. And he talks about that. He talks about how male sexuality has been appropriated by the pornographers and how men have to take back their sexuality, to have a sexuality that's one premised on respecting women and girls, one that is not premised on domination and subordination.
So pornography is based on domination?
Yes.
And erotica?
Equality.
That's really an interesting distinction. That's another major educational campaign.
Yes.
So where do you start? I mean, we all talked about for years, non-sexist early education for children, examples with parents. We know that men who batter usually come from families that have battered, and vice versa, women. How do we ever change this?
I think that it is some of the most important work that we could be doing.
Right.
And it's one of the things is to begin to have these conversations. There's a real reluctance to talk about, for instance, the pornography issue. Those who talk about pornography in this country are immediately shut down.
Right, because we don't want to be censors.
Right, and we don't want to be censors, but we must be political, and we must begin to look at those things. In fact, it's an exercise of the First Amendment I've been arguing for years, to talk about the difficult things that are impacting us politically.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. So do you testify in front, do you go all over? You work a lot at the UN.
Yes.
You're which they call an NGO, a non-governmental organization.
We're the only one with consultative status at the UN on the issue of human trafficking.
That's very interesting. That's important, isn't it?
Yes. Well, we get to influence policy, we'd like to think.
And then what happens when the UN has the policies? It then becomes a job to have the countries then carry on the policies and filter it down.
We'll hopefully have these discussions, kind of just like the one we're having right here now, which will then hopefully impact policy. And then also a lot of our work is done by our partners in their countries, and we support each other's work. We're about to have a meeting here in New York. This is upcoming, is the Commission on the Status of Women's meeting, Beijing plus 15, and we'll be having 3 programs at the UN.
Oh, that's great. That'll be very interesting. Now, what do you do domestically? Do Do you go down to Washington? Do you go to, tell me.
Yes, actually we have, our work in the United States and North America is growing. And one of the things we've done is we are part of the New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition. Right here in New York State, we've worked with a wonderful coalition. Some of our main partners include Equality Now, another wonderful NGO. And we, together with that coalition, which has many members, including Sanctuary for Families, an organization you're familiar with, and ECPAC, we were successful in passing the nation's strongest law against human trafficking right here in New York. We did have the help of former Governor Spitzer.
That's a whole nother subject, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot to learn from what happened there.
Yeah.
He was part of the problem, and yet he was also part of the solution.
Yeah, it's an
Very
amazing.
painful incident in our political life.
Are you now? You're now going to do the UN thing.
Yes.
Are you part of? Are you funded? How do you get funded? Through?
We are funded. We have funders, some of them here in the United States. We have some wonderful funders who are very clear about the issue we've been talking about. They want to see a women-led abolitionist organization taking on commercial sexual exploitation. So we have a couple of funders here in the United States. One of those funders, by the way, is the GTIP office. The GTIP office, which is part of the State Department, which is the Trafficking in Persons office. They fund some of our work. Mm-hmm. But we also have funding from the government of Norway.
Oh, that's good.
Which is a wonderful place to have support, because we all know how they lead in the world with their funding of human rights advocacy.
Do you have a website people can go to?
The Coalition Against Trafficking and Women International.org.
We've come to the end of this half hour. It goes so quickly.
Certainly
So
did.
thank you very much, Norma Ramos. And we will look to follow your work and hope it gets to be successful all over.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.